Hello viewer. I hate the media. You probably do too. And I'm going to explain to you why I particularly hate the media. To do that, I first have to tell you about a philosopher called Max Stirner. Maybe you know him, maybe you don't. I'll give him a quick introduction. Max Stirner was a young Hegelian, a sort of... he was a pioneer in many philosophies: egoism, anarchism, some forms of even anarcho-capitalism. You could say that his ideas are best represented within some aspects of ANCAP philosophy and in voluntarist societal ideas. He is well known mainly because Marx dedicated quite a bit of writing to him in Das Kapital, saying that he's an idiot and that he basically debunking Stirner's theories. But his own most famous work is The Ego and Its Own, Das Selbe and Das Eigene, and in which he basically presents the idea that the only thing that matters is the individual and his happiness. Everything else is spooks, as he calls it. And that's the most interesting part of Stirner's philosophy, is spooks, and it's most often misused and most often miscited part of his philosophy. And it basically, the basic essence of spooks is that these are any idea that stands in the way of self-fulfillment of the individual, that is not properly founded, that has no real observable purpose, and in essence is a blockage to self-development, is a spook. I take that idea and I say, well, there's such a thing as collective societal spooks. And there really are many ideas that are spooks in society. Things that serve only to distract you and don't serve really a purpose in actually advancing the course of society or the collective interest. And that's what the media does. The education system does this to an extent, in which you are educated to have a lot of values, in which you are taught controlled rebellion, because a lot of these people who are environmentalists and are social justice warriors and so on basically have learned this in school and have carried on promoting these values. And really, if you learn it in school, how rebellious can it really be? And it's a contained rebellion, because that's how the system works. It likes to control both parties. The opposition is a controlled opposition most of the time. Not authentically in the sense that they know themselves to be that, but the ideas are controlled and the message is controlled, and that's where the media plays a huge role, because it distracts you. We have all these things going on: centralization of powers. The big fundamental developments in the West of the last, since the war, have been big centralization of power and authority into oligarchic and technocratic power structures. Your individual freedoms are taken away. Your economic power is being plundered through central banking and interest rates. It's what sometimes is called the high-low versus middle problem, where elites and the underclass use their power to exploit the productive middle class, the workers. Because the lower classes have, in a democracy, have voting power, and the elites have money and control over the message, such as the media. And thus they use this power to rentier and not have to do any work of their own, not be productive of those who are productive, through inflation, through, for the lower classes, welfare, of course. So that's the big phenomena, is the decentralization and pillaging of the middle classes, and the disappearance of individual rights. And this is barely talked about, really, because the media is constantly busy distracting you. It's constantly talking about, race, gender, and to an extent race is a distraction. Yes, race is real, race matters, but it is to an extent a distraction because it's just one part of a greater whole. One of the reasons mass immigration, in my opinion, exists is because it's a good distraction. It keeps you busy hating your neighbor. And that's sort of semi-Marxist rhetoric, where, if we could only unite against the man, then we'd be able to overthrow this whole exploitative system, and really the black guy next to you is your brother as much as your white neighbor. But that's of course not the case, because the immigrants are a hostile element to the native population, and they will not be solidarity. There will be no solidarity from them with us. For our part, the native populations have tried, and it hasn't happened. So there's never going to be this idea of race-blind class solidarity against the upper classes exploiting us. And besides, it's not just the upper class, it's the lower classes play much a part of this as anything. And it's really the middle class that should be the party that rises up, because they're the ones being pillaged, they're the ones doing the productive labor. It's the working class, as in laborers and middle classes, people who actually provide value. And working class isn't working class really anymore, because if you actually work a job, a relatively skilled job, like an electrician, a plumber, anything like that, you actually earn a pretty decent living, and you're part of the middle class. The lower class really is like flex contract workers, 0-hour workers, this sort of thing. Anyway, people don't realize they're being exploited. People don't realize that their rights are taken away, like in this current crisis where it's all for your own good, we have to do this or that. Because the party that should be informing you and allowing you to, reflect on what's happening in society, which is the media, is constantly busy distracting you. Especially about this race crap, about gender. And really, the people who do that aren't even aware that they're doing it. Many journalists genuinely believe that what they're doing is for a good cause. But all of this stuff is a distraction away from the real issues. And then there's some journalists who do their job, right? WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks is the only form of real journalism that's been happening in a long time. And what does WikiLeaks do? It just publishes documents without commentary. It just publishes factual information. That's all it does. From leakers. The name, it's in the name, really. And that's one of the few ways there's any oversight of a government, because you won't get that from the regular media. The regular media is busy spinning narratives about Russian conspiracies and interferences in elections. They did it here in the Netherlands. They had an inquiry into alternative media to see if they had any Russian funding. Of course, there wasn't any, because it's a completely whole cloth made up story. It's all nonsense, and your mind's being occupied with nonsense. And very few people are going to actually go to WikiLeaks, read everything themselves, and form a proper opinion, because it's opportunity cost. People don't have that kind of time to be consuming information. That's why the media exists. It's a funnel for information to filter through, and the theory is that the most important information thus gets disseminated to the population. But talking about transgender bathrooms is really not the important part that should be talked about in society. Which all this essentially means that governments have no real transparency. Whenever there's some scandal or some news story that actually hits the people in government, it's usually because there's faction wars within the government going on themselves. One party wants another party damaged, so they leak a story. It's never really journalists doing independent research. Again, with the occasional exception of WikiLeaks. But have you been keeping up with WikiLeaks? Have you been keeping up with what has been happening to Assange, who has been basically tortured in prison, is being denied bail despite being not a dangerous criminal, in a prison where he has a high risk of dying due to poor conditions? No. Why don't you keep up with Assange and WikiLeaks? Because the media doesn't talk about it. And you still get most of your news from the media. You might think you don't. You might think, oh no, I get my news from YouTube and from podcasts and alternative media. I listen to a lot of alternative media. I don't watch news or anything, but I keep up with both news cycles. And what you notice is that alternative media isn't alternative media at all. Their news, the stories they talk about, all come from the regular media. There's no fact-finding in alternative media. There's no original stories. If you listen to these news podcasts from the reactionary right and so on, they're always discussing current events, and the current events are being dictated by the regular media. The only exception to this usually is financial media, because financial media has a lot of money invested in it and has a lot of people. It's more obvious to see, so there's more alternative media there, and there's a lot more dissent about economics, because people stand to lose money there, and so things have to be more realistic. So there's good alternative media in financial news, but nothing in real, like on social, on cultural issues. People talk about what's the order of the day. So there won't actually be any real alternative media until people start doing their own fact-finding, start formulating their own stories, start trying to form a news cycle of their own. Because otherwise you're still just being played by the stories of the mainstream. There's nothing alternative about you at that point. And that's kind of the point I want to make here. You're being fed spooks all the time, irrelevant ideas. What you should be looking at is the bigger picture, which is not just the race stuff, not just the transgender stuff. It's over a very large part. It's economic issues, it's political control, the kind of centralization of power that means. What relevance does mass democracy really have if all the decisions are really made behind closed doors? Nothing ever gets voted on or put in political programs. The political debates are about theoretical, ideological differences, but no practical facts. The short news cycle and the short cycle of political elections also means that people that the issues from the past never get addressed. Has anyone ever really been put to the task for the Iraq War, for the 2008 bailouts? So many stories you could go back to. No, with this short news cycle and with this cycle of electoral politics, you end up with people being never held accountable for what they do. Politicians, that is, and bankers and so on. Really, that's my message. If you are in alternative media, you want to be informed, you got to go to the primary sources yourselves, and that's not workable for most people. So if you want genuine alternative media, you want to get rid of these spooks and talk about what the actual issues are, I'm going to have to be having some fact finding. So this is a message mainly to podcasters and so on there. You want actual alternative, you form your own news cycle.